Hi, everybody. Today, we are going to be talking about understanding development and how our understanding of development is going to inform our observation of young children. And so, gonna get the PowerPoint pulled up for you here, and then just briefly to share kind of what we want to achieve today. We're going to talk about the developmental perspectives that relate to observation, as I just said. We're going to kind of define observation and recording, talk about why we would observe young children, what are our reasons and our rationales for that. And then if you remember from last class, we were able to look at the difference between objective and subjective observations. And we've already talked about the difference between very generalized and more specific observations. So we're kind of jumping around in terms of content, but if you remember this visual from our first class meeting, this is that guidance pyramid that we talked about. And we spent some time already discussing how the foundation of our guidance principles come from these appropriate expectations based on our understanding of child development. So our understanding and the knowledge that we have about young children, again, is going to help us as we learn to observe and analyze children's behaviors. This idea of developmentally appropriate expectations. We need to understand typical patterns of development because that's the first step in understanding what are developmentally appropriate expectations. And that helps guide our approach towards child guidance. So again, developmentally appropriate practice or developmentally appropriate expectations are based on knowing typical patterns of development. So here's some examples. When infants begin to scream because they've seen a stranger, we understand that they are in the stage of development that is called stranger anxiety. And this means that they know and remember the faces of their close caregivers and then compare new individuals to what they already know. We also know about toddlers that when they get into that phase of saying no or mine or I do it, they've reached a typical stage in development where they recognize themselves as being separate from their caregivers, and they're asserting their autonomy and wanting to become more independent. Finally, as we think about preschoolers, we know that 4-year-olds, when they use bad words, they're experimenting with the social power of language and they're trying to get a reaction. Most often, they don't really understand the power of the words they're using. They just are, sort of, it's like a social experiment to see how others will react. So understanding this information is going to allow us to recognize when certain behaviors are typical or not. And then, we will know based on that how we should guide the behavior, when it might be an appropriate time to make a referral to someone with more expertise about either a delay in development or, patterns of behavior that might be sort of atypical or unusual in a child. When we think about knowing individual children, we understand that a child's genetic makeup, their temperament, their abilities, perhaps their disabilities, their particular interests and personal experiences, all of these understandings about a specific child are also going to help guide our approaches to child guidance. So an example of that is that if we know some children have a temperament that we call slow to warm, and so, when we're interacting with a child like that, we understand that it's important to give them time and space, to get more comfortable with an adult or an experience so that, they feel, like they're coming to it on their own. We wouldn't want to force a child who's slow to warm into something before they were ready for it. And then finally, when we think about how we understand family and cultural issues as it relates to guidance and in our interactions with children, here are some things to be aware of. We understand that, from infancy, children are absorbing the values and the expectations of their families and also the broader culture. So how we dress, how we talk, how we respond to others, our specific mannerisms, those are all influenced by family and society. This becomes part of who the child is, and then they bring that with them into the classroom, where sometimes rules and expectations are different from family or cultural norms. And so again, this understanding of family and cultural issues is going to impact the guidance that adults provide to children, or it should influence. So some principles of development, just to kind of hone in on. Again, development refers to this increasing complexity of various skills and attributes within the child. These include motor development, language development, mental and cognitive development, and also social and emotional development. There are several principles that govern these changes in children, and these principles are going to form the basis for your decisions as you work with children and families. The principles are as follows. 1, development is not random. It always follows predictable patterns, and each milestone kind of builds on what came before it. That is true of all children. Development follows the same trajectory in terms of the pattern. Development also proceeds from broad, generalized abilities down to more refined, specific skills. For example, infants learn how to wave their arms with little control before they become toddlers and preschoolers who develop more specific and refined fine motor skills to, grasp tools and things like that. The third principle to be aware of is that the sequence of development that I talked about in my first point, that development is not random, it follows a specific sequence. That sequence is the same for all children. However, the rate of progress varies from person to person, sometimes just a little bit, and sometimes it varies greatly. And it can also vary from one domain of development to another. So you might see sometimes a really rapid, rapidly developing gross motor skills, where a child isn't necessarily developing language as quickly. So different spurts can kind of happen across different domains of development. And sometimes we also see regression. Regression can happen particularly in one area when we're seeing growth, major growth in another area. But sometimes regression just happens based on different life experiences. I remember my daughter was 6. We moved recently into a new home, and it's been over a year ago now. But when we first relocated, she experienced some bedwetting. That was a behavior we hadn't seen in a year or two at that point. And I think it was directly related to that sort of major life change. And so I'm just using that as an example that sometimes we see regression happen as it relates to big changes in life as well. So this is a visual to sort of show you the domains of development that we're talking about here. These are integrated. You can see through the visual that there is overlap in terms of how these domains are laid out. And so oftentimes when we think about a learning experience or something happening in the classroom for a young child, we can see very clearly how it's related maybe to cognitive development. And, then if we take a little bit more of a careful look at that interaction or that experience, we can also see how language development, maybe physical development or social and emotional development also come into play. These five domains that you're seeing on the screen, these are coming from the North Carolina Foundations for Early Learning and Development. It's called the Fields text. And so there's an extra one added here. Your book outlines 4. Those are physical, emotional, social, and cognitive. And this approaches to learning, the 5th domain, is coming from the North Carolina Foundations for Learning, because our state recognizes that developing things like curiosity, a sense of wonder, those type of, I guess, cognitive skills, if you will. They're called approaches to learning in our state, and they're recognized as being important to children's development and, you know, overall success in learning in general. So these are the domains of growth and development in young children. And the main thing to be aware of is that they're not mutually exclusive of one another. As I said, we often see lots of overlay and interconnectedness among these different areas. Another idea that I want you to be aware of when we think about development and the concepts related to it are that we have to focus on the whole child. So I just sort of alluded to this in my discussion of the different domains, but each domain is influenced by and also influences other domains of development. So an example of that, when we think about infants, the infant is first able to crawl, and then the development of those muscles and motor skills allow that child to cruise on furniture, pulling up to standing and then holding on and moving their feet while they cruise. And then finally they're able to walk. And that opens up a whole new world, right? Being able to access their environment and move through space independently. That opens up so many new opportunities for them to begin to explore the world, which results then in them learning new concepts, cognitive development, right? And also they develop this sense of pride and self-confidence, which is related to their emotional development. So in that example I just gave, you can see what I was talking about before with how development and skills build upon one another in the example of crawling and then walking, and then how those different domains are interconnected, because walking allows for increase in cognitive and also social and emotional development. Some key points just to be aware of as it relates to this focus on the whole child are that positive life experiences strengthen biological systems. We're going to talk a bit about brain development, and brain development is what supports the developing abilities and the child's learning capacity. And then health, good health is this foundation for strong brain development. So, you know, again, we're talking about focus on the whole child, and you can see how early life experiences, what's happening in the sort of nurture realm relates to that nature piece, what's happening internally inside the child in terms of brain development and physical health. Again, it's all interconnected and interrelated. Interrelated domains also account for negative outcomes in the child. So we will look at some stressors in a bit, and it's important to know that prolonged excessive stress actually inhibits brain development, and it leads to poor health in adulthood. So you know, in the same way that positive early learning experiences contribute to positive outcomes, negative life experiences have negative implications and repercussions as the child grows into a teen and adult. And then it's really important to point out that social and emotional development supports all learning, because children first and foremost need to feel safe and secure before they can focus their attention on learning. I showed you guys a visual of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And, you know, when we think about moving up that pyramid to the more sort of complex areas, safety was one of those really foundational pieces. It comes right after physiological needs being met. And so as we move through the course, we'll talk about this idea a lot more, but the concept of feeling safe and secure, again, is super foundational to being able to learn and be successful in a classroom setting. Some other factors that influence development, there's this idea of maturation. Maturation, motivation, experience, and temperament. These all interact to influence a child's development. Maturation is that general rate of growth across domains. It's largely dependent upon your genetic makeup, And it's sort of the term given to that, that trajectory or that progression of development in a child. Motivation. That one's pretty straightforward. That is a person's incentive or their desire to learn a behavior. Experiences are opportunities that the child has within their environment. So as adults, we want to provide environments that are conducive for learning and that give children lots of opportunities for, rich and meaningful experiences. And then temperament is that sort of general way within the individual that they respond to experiences. And so again, all of these factors sort of work together to influence a specific child's development. Temperament is our key as an adult to understanding the child's behavior. It's also our key to guiding our approach to each individual child. So, we understand that things like the intensity and the duration of a child's reaction, how they approach new experiences. As I said, if they're slow to warm, we're going to sort of approach that differently than the child who's very outgoing. Their general mood, are they mostly happy, or are they more of a, kind of quiet, reserved, not so happy child? Can they persist and persevere with a challenging activity, or do they get very frustrated and give up? You can see how all of these different facets of the child are going to be important in us as adults considering how we're going to work with that child. And then temperament is sort of grouped into these three major groups. So I want to just give you, what these are, and then give you some kind of thinking points about temperament. And then this idea of goodness of fit. Goodness of fit is kind of matching our approach as an adult to the child's temperament. And then, it creates what we call a goodness of fit. So the first temperament is flexible. Flexible children adapt easily. They make very few demands on their caregivers, generally sort of what we would call easy. Fearful children are slower to warm up, and they're very hesitant when things in the environment change. Yes. And then feisty is the term that is given to children who are very outspoken. They have strong expression of what they like, what they dislike, what they prefer. So when you think about these three groups, how would you describe your own temperament? Can you clearly see how you fit into this model? Are you generally flexible, easygoing, cheerful? Do you tend to get upset with changes in your routine or have strong reactions to things that happen? Are you shy and stand back when confrontation or new people come into your environment? Or, as I want to point out, are you some combination of these temperaments? I can see how kind of each of these shows up for me in my own life and in my own children. But I can also sort of see how we are more, kind of one than the other. We all have a tendency towards one of these more than the other, I think. And that's what we would refer to as our temperament. So thinking about the brain and how it impacts development. When we think about the brain, we typically think about cognitive development, but really the brain is where there is this interplay among all the different domains. Developmental cognitive neuroscience is a fairly new area of study that involves the collaboration across many disciplines, including psychologists, neuroscientists, medical professionals, even biologists. And the aim of this field is to understand the relationship between changes within the brain, what happens in the environment, and how the child is functioning within the environment. This is all sort of based on these PET scans, images that were taken of children in Romanian orphanages, where some famous studies showed that you could actually see gaps in the brains of these children who were experiencing severe neglect. And so this brought light to the importance of the early years and brain development. But it also led to a lot of misinformation and sort of misguided efforts early on at this concept of building children's brains. There were lots of commercial products that were, developed that really, toys and things that were intended to build brains. But what that did was actually take children's opportunities to be interacting with caregivers away to some extent. And we know now that those interactions are really what do the brain building. Yes. So here are the images of the brain that I just referred to. You can see how, particularly in this picture over here, the normal brain has much more gray matter, is what they call it, than this brain with, it looks like actual holes in it of children who experienced that extreme neglect. And then this image over here is where we're seeing kind of more of the neurons and things like that that are firing when children are getting those rich, interactive experiences that they need for their brains to grow. So I'm going to take a pause for just a minute and show you a quick video that's related to what we're talking about before we talk more about the brain. If I can get to it. Let's see. I don't know. I'm hopeful. I'm going to try one more time just to make sure. I don't want you guys to sit there with nothing to see. All right, here we go. It's about 8 minutes long, but it's got good information that will kind of bolster our conversation.
A baby's brain. Less than 1 pound gelatinous tissue. Within its milky, convoluted folds, a universe of meaning. Emotions, ideas, memories, dreams, all will somehow find a home here, evolving and changing over a lifetime.
The ultimate machine and the ultimate source of everything. We understand the world the way we do because of the brains we have. We will understand the brain itself the way we will because of the brains we have.
The brain is the most complex thing on earth. Even the brain of a baby is wildly complicated.
A piece of the brain, the size of a grain of rice, contains about 10,000 nerve cells, just in that little piece. You can just imagine how many pieces you have in your head. Within that 10,000 nerve cells, each nerve cell can make anywhere between 1 to 10,000 connections with other nerve cells. So there are something like 1 trillion connections.
It's almost overwhelming to think about the whole thing. If you think about how the whole brain and nervous system gets assembled, you just want to throw up your hands and say it's way too complicated. We're never going to understand it. The brain is the seat of our consciousness, of who we are. And in understanding where it comes from, we understand where we come from.
By 24 weeks, the vital organs of the fetus are well formed. The primitive heart can beat on its own. The once powerless lungs are now prepared to fill with air. And the brain has nearly its full complement of billions and billions of neurons, reaching out to each other, building connections with mind-boggling speed, nearly 2 million every second, until the brain has become a tightly packed network of trillions of crisscrossing wires, with more connections than stars in the sky.
you can imagine the size of the wiring problem. So how is that problem solved? How is that achieved during development? How is it that each one of those trillion connections is made appropriately?
You might think, oh, what a mess. It's just going to be a jumble of connections and wires all over the place. But in fact, the nervous system seems to have a strategy.
The strategy is in the genes. The brain begins to wire itself by following a precisely specified genetic blueprint.
The connections are following very defined rules. You know, go out of the eye, turn right at the optic chiasm, cross the chiasm, head toward the lateral geniculate nucleus, grow into the lateral geniculate nucleus. Don't grow into the medial geniculate nucleus because that's an auditory structure. So you can imagine the first stage of brain wiring is kind of like solving the problem of connecting phones in New York to phones in Boston. Making sure that you're making connections between Boston and New York and not Boston and Washington, D.C. And that's all specified genetically. Now then there's a second phase of brain wiring. Let's say you want to place a phone call to your grandmother in New York. You want that phone to ring, you know, on Park Avenue and 47th or whatever. You don't want the phone to ring up at the Waldorf Astoria. Okay, how do you get that precise phone to ring? That's the second phase of brain wiring. If you place a phone call to your grandmother early in development, her phone will ring. But so will a lot of other phones. So there are a lot of connections that are made. If the connections are correct and being used, they get strengthened. If they're not being used, or they're only being used occasionally, they're lost. We could call it use it or lose it. So the field brain is really a dynamic structure that's constantly changing in response to this process of strengthening appropriate connections and pruning inappropriate connections.
Eventually, there will be trillions and trillions of connections between cells, charged with electrical pulses rippling like lightning storms across the hills and valleys of the brain's deeply furrowed tissue. Every cell in its place, every link between cells carefully organized. Nothing random, nothing arbitrary.
What we would really love to understand is how the brain during development generates millions and millions of neurons, sends them to the right position in the brain, and then somehow instructs each of those individual nerve cells to form very, very specific connections with one another.
A child's brain. A swirling profusion of billions and billions of neurons, reaching out to billions more neurons to form trillions of connections, pulsing with electric and chemical energy.
Exuberant connectivity. The cells literally are going wild making all these connections, discovering each other, forming the basis of what we call something learned. Learning is about connection and connectivity.
For a child just learning to read, even a single letter will set off a complex series of reactions. The brain begins by focusing its attention on the reading task itself. Then it captures a visual representation of the letter and sends it to the areas of the brain where the visual symbol gets hooked up to the letter's sound and meaning.
You start with a block of marble, like a sculptor would. And there's a lot of marble there. A young child has hundreds of trillions of connections in the brain, twice as many connections as the adult. And then comes along the sculptor who takes away bits of the marble to reveal a form. Experience is the sculptor. Experience determines which of those connections to take away and which to leave. That's what learning is. It's changing the weights of the connections in the brain depending on experience.
Okay, so you saw, okay, sorry about that. So you could see in that video how, you know, from this neuroscience perspective, our understanding of the brain and how initially those synapses are coming from kind of a genetic code, they said, and then experience and interaction with the environment and with caregivers and things like that is what creates that process of connections among those different synapses. And then synaptic pruning is something that was also alluded to. That's the process of those connections dying off or going away. And so again, you can see, you know, how clear it is that we as caregivers for children need to be making sure that we're promoting that brain development and brain growth through high quality interactions, experiences in the environment that contribute to learning, because that process of those connections happening in the brain is actually, you know, the child doing their learning and development. Going back to the PowerPoint now, just a few more things to kind of point out about brain development. Some requirements for this healthy brain development are good nutrition, adequate rest, secure attachment, so feelings of safety with the caregiver or the adult in the child's environment, and then again, those appropriate amounts of stimulation. But you can see that, you know, again, there's this foundational piece of physiological needs being met, good nutrition and rest, and without those, and then that safety piece of secure attachment, that is going to inhibit the child's brain development. So we want to make sure that all of the pieces are in place. Again, kind of looking at that whole child approach. I mentioned earlier that stress is a factor that, that influences development, right? Stress, it's important to know. So first of all, the definition of stress is that it's the body's physiological response to discomfort. So when I give you that definition, we understand as humans that stress cannot be completely eliminated. And actually, there is such a thing as healthy stress. Certain amounts of discomfort lead to growth and development. However, when children or adults experience prolonged and severe stress, this is not good. It creates a situation that we now in the research call toxic stress. And this can be an example of this when babies cry for prolonged periods of time and they don't get a response that matches their needs, then they can experience what can become toxic stress. I'm going to show you a video that sort of is how we learned this. It's the research around this understanding of serve and return. And that's the idea that when an infant cries, the responsive caregiver in their environment, addresses that need. They come over, they comfort, they provide for the child in a way that meets, maybe the child's crying because they have a wet diaper and they need to be changed. But no response to the infant cry or a mismatched response or harsh response can result in this sort of toxic stress type situation. And that has really negative implications for the child's development. So this is just a really like a 2-minute video that I'm gonna share.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions,
just a sec.
The activity and the social interaction.
It's so hard for me without any feedback from you guys to make sure that I'm sharing what I want you to be seeing. So I'm just gonna manually do that one more time. Okay, here we go. It's called the still face experiment.
The world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. And the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
Oh, my girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her. This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, come on, why aren't we doing this? Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
I'm coming back, sorry. All right, yeah, and so what he just said, the child being stuck in that kind of ugly situation, that is what we're referring to when we talk about toxic stress. I don't know if you're anything like me, but that video is almost like, it's heart-wrenching to watch. It's so uncomfortable to see that infant, grasping for interaction from the mother that she's withholding, for just that really brief period of time. But you can clearly see how impactful that was for the child. I mean, that infant became very distressed when she realized that serve and return that I just talked about, that it wasn't happening with the mother. And you could see the infant really reaching out in all the ways that she could to try and get that interaction back. And so, I think this video gives us a great visual as it relates to, that idea of neglect, or, how important our reactions and responses to infants can be. But it also really highlights to me the power that, we don't always give young children the credit I think that they deserve. And that's just a really powerful example of how infants are communicating with us before they can talk. They're understanding social cues before we probably realize. And I just think that's such a really powerful visual to share with you. I just have one more slide on the brain and these key aspects of brain development that are kind of important to understand, because again, understanding brain development helps us understand child development, and our understanding of these concepts, is going to impact how we engage and how we interact with children. And so this idea of executive function, this encompasses the way the brain manages and processes information. Executive function includes the ability to remember, to pay attention, to control impulses, like, you know, when 4 and 5-year-olds start developing the ability to not reach out and hit another child, but to stop and use language, that's impulse control. And then it also, executive function helps us adjust our thinking as circumstances around us change. So these skills begin in early childhood when the brain is forming. And as you can imagine, exposure to high levels of stress or anxiety, or even abuse and neglect, will impact children's executive functioning, which again is going to influence them in all areas of learning and development. So when we are working with children, we need to recognize that children don't misbehave because they're bad children or because they're deliberately trying to break the rules. We need to know that their brains are still developing and this executive function is still forming. So again, I said, you know, when children reach 4 or 5 years old, that's when they actually have developed the ability to pause and think through what's the best response in this conflict, and not to hit the other child or to be physically aggressive, but to use language. That's a skill that they don't have in place until they're around that age. So we can support this by helping them remember rules, social norms, and giving them lots of reminders, but also understanding, right, that it's not born out of defiance. It's really an inability to do anything different a lot of the time. And so this relates to self-regulation, because, you know, we can see that self-regulation is the ability to control one's emotions and then behavior. And, you know, it begins in this physical realm, and it's very related to executive functioning. So when I say it begins in the physical realm, infants learning how to soothe themselves, how to calm themselves down from crying, that is related to, and again, it's based on their caregiver interaction. So, you know, when an infant cries early on and the mother or the caregiver comes and picks them up and rocks them and soothes them, that's how they learn initially. And then they can kind of develop the ability to do that on their own, to calm themselves internally. And self-regulation, this idea of self-regulation, according to several studies in the research, this has greater influence on school readiness than cognitive development or family characteristics. So it's really important for us as caregivers, you know, to, or teachers or whatever role you're going to find yourself in, it's really important to understand that cognitive function, executive function, how it relates to self-regulation, and then things that we can do to help children learn to regulate themselves actually are more important in terms of school readiness than maybe other things that we would think would be, you know, of the utmost importance. And so I hope you can see from this conversation that we just had how, you know, how important it is to understand development and then be aware of the ways in which, you know, how we understand children and how we understand their growth is going to influence how we respond to and guide their behavior.